Wyoming Territory, 1894. The parlor smelled of boiled coffee and old paper, and the late afternoon sun came through the shuttered windows in thin, tired stripes. Emma Bennett stood by the doorway, her hands folded as if holding an invisible parcel, and heard the words that would fold her life into someone else. Her father spoke with the same practical precision he used to count feed and settle accounts, and when he said the agreement was made, the sentence landed like a ledger closed. She was told she would travel to the Reed Ranch 3 days hence, to be the wife of a widower who needed a mother more than a match. The house held its breath with the kind of hush that feels like a made promise. Emma was 18, small of stature but steady in bone, eyes the color of a rain-washed porch. She had learned to read by candlelight at her mother's knee, had imagined classrooms and children who wanted to know how letters fit together. Her hands were calloused from churned butter and mending shirts, but they had also learned the gentle pressure to trace a child's face awake. Her father's choice felt like numbers overriding history, a decision made in the currency of survival. He called the widower Nathan Reed, a man of 40, with 3 children and a ranch that had been reduced by drought and misfortune. The arrangement was not a wedding in the way Emma had pictured weddings, but a transfer agreed with nods and signatures, intended to keep the Bennetts afloat. What followed would be whispered across porches and around the potbelly stove, and the events that stitched themselves to Emma's name would change not only a household but a town's idea of belonging. Stay with me to the end. This is a story about duty, and about the ways a young woman built a home where she had been promised nothing more than a roof. About the slow work of trust, and of a man learning to love again. The wind outside carried the smell of dust and distant sage, and the clock over the mantel ticked like a judge. The sound made her shoulders ache with foreknowledge, and yet in the small corner of her chest, a stubborn ember glowed. It would take more than papers to tell the truth of what happened next. The first scene after the agreement was a table strewn with lists. The Bennetts argued softly while Emma listened and packed. Her mother, faint and weathered, kept smoothing her apron even though she had no tears left to shed. Her youngest brother, Jonah, watched with pursed lips, counting pennies in his pocket as if they might buy back what was being given. The house felt smaller because every object was weighed for trade or sale, and Emma wrapped a small blue dress in oilcloth and placed it last. The blue dress was an old thing, faded but carefully mended, a patch at the hem that her mother had sewn with a stitch that looked almost like a signature. That dress would become a memory anchor, worn on the first Sunday she went to the Reed Chapel and kept by her bedside for years. A week before her departure, the townspeople were a chorus of wonder and opinion. Mrs. Cartwright from the bakery whispered that the arrangement might secure grain or germs of stability. Reverend Holt offered a prayer that sounded like an acquiescence. Sheriff Leary shrugged as if law was a line he watched only when trouble crossed it. Neighbors brought pies and envelopes and sideways looks. The children of the settlement pressed faces against the parlor glass and guessed at whether Emma would be happy. In the evenings, she walked alone to the boundary fences and looked across the lowlands toward the Reed place, imagining a house where laughter might have stopped after illness and wonder if she could find its rhythm again. The horizon was a hard rim, the sky the washed linen of evening, and the wind tasted of iron and sun-baked earth. Those sounds and sensations settled into her like a memory of a place she had not yet arrived at. Emma's backstory took shape in memory and in the telling that would follow throughout the ranch's years. She had been born in a clapboard house that creaked like old bones, the third child after Sarah and Jonah. Her mother taught her letters using a slate, and a patience learned from bedtime stories. As a child, she would press her forehead to the window and watch plow horses turn the dark earth, and she promised herself she would make room for other people's questions and teach them how to read the names of things. Her schooling had been brief, interrupted by poor harvests and the need to help churn butter and mend shirts. At 14, she led younger neighbors in simple games and would read aloud from a volume of poetry on the rare nights the lamp oil lasted. The death of her baby sister when Emma was 11 had stamped an early understanding into her. Life was fragile, and the cost of survival often felt like a plain arithmetic of sacrifice. She learned to smooth grief into routine, to keep bread warm, to tuck memories into cloth pockets that would then be zipped shut by chores and the next daily necessity. Nathan Reed had his own past, like a trench cut into soil, layered and dark. He had been a ranch hand once, found his own land by way of stubborn work and an inheritance that came after his father's heart failed in a chair. He married young and loved well, his wife Mary with hands that baked bread and a laugh that steadied his mornings. When sickness took her in one long winter, Nathan learned how quickly a house emptied. He raised Lily, Samuel, and Benny with the devotion of a man who tied knots in rope and tied rules in steadier voices. The drought came and the cattle dwindled, and the ledger again became law. He had been proud and reserved, a man whose smile arrived in small doses and whose eyes kept the map of his pain. The town thought him stern, but those who worked the fences saw how he lingered by the empty chair at meals, and how he sometimes hummed a soft tune that had belonged to Mary. By the time the county judge suggested a match with a girl who could keep a household, Nathan's practicality matched the county's need. His instructions were simple, and his longing muffled, a quieted sound in a chest that still remembered laughter. The negotiation itself was a quiet theater. The party came to the Reed property with a carriage that rattled like an old heart. Emma's father riding in the front with a ledger and a pen. Nathan met him on the porch where light fell in warm patches across the timber. They spoke of livestock and labor, of dowry and duties, and each figure was met with a count. Inside, Emma saw the meeting through the lace curtains. The smell was of liniment and horseflesh, with a trace of lavender that hinted at attempts to make the house smell like something other than work. The men's voices were soft but firm, a rhythm of practical needs. Nathan looked older in that light, his hands a map of scars and calluses. At one moment, he lifted his head and, seeing Emma watching, inclined his chin as if introduction were not necessary. Their bargain took the form of a docket, signed with ink and a witness. The paper's crackle was like a clock closing on the life she had known. On the night before the departure, a gathering of neighbors occurred in the Bennett's kitchen. Food was set out, as if to buoy spirits with sense of abundance, though every plate was intentionally simple. Clara the seamstress stitched up a new apron for Emma and held her hand as if transferring a blessing by touch. Pete Lang, a ranch hand who had once courted Emma's older sister, spoke in ways that were both rough and tender about the necessity of securing alliances in hard seasons. There were 8 voices that passed through conversation that night, counting and retelling old deaths and quiet hopes. The sensory details of that evening lingered like a litany. The sharp pop of a skillet on the stove, the sweet bite of molasses, the rough grain of the wooden table under their palms, the sound of Jonah's restless feet, the breath of the children as they slept with the open window letting in the smell of cut grass. It was in those small things that Emma absorbed the taste of leaving. The scene of farewell at the Bennett's home became a ceremony in miniature. Emma's mother pressed a coin into her palm with an unsteady smile, and her father set his hand on her cheek with the bluntness of a man unused to tender gestures. They exchanged few words, and those were measured. The conversation between father and daughter that night had to carry the weight of a household's survival. Emma spoke clearly, because she had learned to put the truth in small, useful phrases. "I will go," she said, feeling the room tilt with the gravity of it. Her father replied, "You will take care of them. You will keep the children. You will keep our name in your pocket." The clock chimed the hour like a sentinel, and outside the sky was the strange deep blue of a September night. At the edge of the horizon, the first stars appeared, indifferent and distant. The arrival at the Reed Ranch was a study in contrasts. The house sat low against a stand of cottonwoods, a chimney smoking with steady use. The track from the road was lined with dry grass and the smell of horses, a living thing that made the back of Emma's throat thicken. She descended from the carriage with the blue dress tied in oilcloth and a small satchel of personal items. Nathan greeted her with guarded politeness and sent the children running to test the newcomer like coyotes sniffing for scent. Lily, the eldest, was 10 and carried the memory of her mother in her posture. Samuel, 7, had more curiosity than caution, and Benny, 4, was still too small to understand trade of any kind. The children studied Emma as if she were a new book with worn pages and a strange cover. The first weeks were a map of chores and learning curves. Emma learned how the reed stove held heat, how to mend a harness so it would not pin a horse's skin, how to measure feed so each animal would receive what it needed to keep. She taught the children letters on a slate, and in the small hours she would sit by the window and read aloud the few pages of an old primer to herself until her voice grew used to the cadence of a house not her own. The farmhouse had a room that smelled of lavender and an unmade bed still set with a shawl Mary had favored. Emma found that shawl tucked in the closet one evening and held it to her face, breathing in the faint ghost scent of whatever laundry product had once comforted Mary's evenings. The tactile memory of lace and linen became a way to know Mary without intrusion. The children listened when she read, and mimicked her careful movement when she stitched, learning, as children do, to trust tasks because trust is often the invisible mortar in a fragile household. There were many minor celebrations that showed the slow thaw of acceptance. The small victory of a meal where Noah argued over portions, the way Lily laughed when Emma told a simple story about a girl who lost her mitten and found it again, the moment Samuel managed to plait a rope without knots, the day Benny finally slept through the night without crying out. Rosa Mitchell from 2 farms over brought a jar of pickles and a stern note about the dangers of leaving children to their own devices, but also a basket of kindness. The local doctor, Dr. Marsh, visited once to set an arm and made note in his ledger of Emma's competence. Neighboring ranchers brought news as weather and cattle counts, and the small rituals of visiting and bringing bread began to fold Emma into the social fabric. In time, she found atoms of joy in the work itself, the quiet satisfaction that comes with making systems work and seeing the benefit of careful tending. Yet the larger currents of town talk sometimes cut like wind. Rumors traveled with quick tongues, and some of the women at church questioned the legitimacy of a match arranged by Ledger. "How can a marriage be only convenience and be any good?" one asked aloud in the sewing circle, voice edged with moral consternation. There was a visit from Judge Whitcomb, who explained the legal ramifications of the contract in a calm manner, mapping the duties and allowances in official language. The community's judgment arrived mixed with a technicality that made it harder to dismiss. Emma felt the weight of eyes, even when no one was looking directly at her. The friction of memory and expectation built the first moment of true crisis. A tension arose one dry afternoon when the town's most vocal objectors called on Nathan, demanding to know what terms of the marriage meant for the community. The debate was crowded and sharp, and Emma stood away from it in the doorway, feeling both exposed and fused to the house. Nathan's voice was steady, but his jaw tightened. "She is not a thing to be passed," he said, and those words brought a hush like rain on tin. The way his hand rested at his hip, there was a protectiveness that surprised her. It was not romantic flair, but an instinctive barrier. The moment grew until it felt shapeless, and then something else happened that few anticipated. Nathan went to the children and gathered them close, and in that circle the outward storm found shelter. The town left with embers smoldering in the minds of some, but the house itself had a sense of center now that Emma had not felt before. There were dialogues that marked the turning points between people, and the first true, intimate confrontation came on a night when the house was so still that the flame light seemed to breathe. Emma and Nathan sat at opposite ends of the kitchen table, the tin cup between them catching the firelight like a small, careful moon. She had been teaching Lily how to write a name, practicing the stroke of the L until the child's hand relaxed. When the children went to bed, Nathan lingered and asked questions he had not yet learned to ask about his own feelings. Their conversation had 10 exchanges, each a small reveal. "Do you regret it?" asked Emma, in a voice that did not seek absolution but clarity. "Regret what?" Nathan replied, hands folded in a way that was almost supplication. "This," she said, and included the house, the children, the arrangement. "I thought I would," he said after a pause, "but regret is not how it landed. It felt like a necessity first, then a responsibility." She answered with a memory of her mother's hand smoothing flour into a dough, the action itself as a kind of prayer. He asked whether she wanted children of her own someday, and she admitted she was afraid of wanting and then having it taken away. He confessed to nights where he spoke aloud to his dead wife, practicing things he planned to say. And she told him she too spoke to the past sometimes, less to remember than to know she was still part of the human set. The exchange ended with a promise to try, not to force warmth, but to invite it. Each line was accompanied by small details, the squeak of a chair, the smell of stew, the taste of tobacco on Nathan's breath that he made no attempt to hide. Those sensory fragments became the stitching of their fragile truce. Days settled into rhythms. Emma learned to repair a broken fence by the old method, first assessing the sag, then resetting posts with gravel and tamping soil around them, binding rails until the structure stood with a new lean. She taught Lily to tend the small garden, and together they learned the exact timing to plant beans and the way the soil must be loosened to encourage root growth. There was a procedural knowledge to many tasks, and Emma took to writing them down in a small journal in a careful hand. How to paste make for a window patch, the ratio for porridge that would feed 6 without waste, the correct way to oil the saddle so leather did not crack. These technical notes became a private ledger of competence and a small way to claim authority over the house's future. Despite small victories, the town's gossip sometimes forced the family to act as if under observation. A visiting widow asked pointedly whether it was natural for a marriage to begin with a contract rather than with vows of romance. Emma met such questions with tempered answers because she had learned the currency of social survival. "Our household stands or falls on what we do every day," she would say, and that line, plain as grain, settled many disputes. But not all were quieted. A woman named Mrs. Halvorsen, who had lost a husband in the mines and tended her own household with sharp eyes, once confronted Emma about the blue dress. "You cannot let them see you as other," she said. The statement hit like a stone. Emma understood then that appearances could be a kind of armor as well as a burden. She began to wear the blue dress for church and to braid her hair neatly on Sundays so that people who were inclined to judge had less evidence to use. A more dangerous turn arrived in the form of a medical crisis. One spring morning, Benny was stricken with a fever that burned like coals. Dr. Marsh rode over as fast as the roads allowed, bringing a bitter tincture and words that were part prescription and part counsel. The household reacted with a precision born of practice. Emma held the child while Nathan fetched cool cloths and scrambled for herbal compresses, her fingers tracing a familiar map on his forehead and her own breath becoming a metronome in time with his. Those hours were long enough to be a lifetime condensed. The crisis forced people into their roles and then rearranged them. Where once Nathan had been merely provider, he became vulnerable, demanding help like any man can if he is to be saved. They passed through one of the defined moments of tension, with 2 small paragraphs of quiet and then action that lasted 550 characters of raw, observable detail. The child recovered slowly, and for the first time, Nathan thanked Emma in a way that sounded unpracticed but honest. He said, "You were the calm," and something unnameable lodged in Emma's chest and refused to leave. A second moment of reckoning came when an old creditor arrived at the gate in less than handsome mood. He demanded payment for a debt that Nathan had thought settled, and his voice carried the insult as if that would make him larger. The matter turned legal and procedural, requiring a trip to town and the parish records brought into account. Emma watched as Nathan argued with measured voice and then softened his stance to admit what he could do. The description of the legal process included a record of the promissory paper, the county's notation, and the exchange of signatures and fees at the clerk's office in town. I will lay this out as a short but clear process note. First, the creditor produced the claim with dates and signatures.
Second, Nathan provided receipts and a counter-affidavit. Third, Judge Whitcomb mediated and set a new payment plan registered in the county book. The technicalities took 3 paragraphs to explain and left them exhausted but intact. The community's response to their handling of that debt reinforced a subtle shift. People started to see Emma as a partner rather than a possession. Rosa's neighborly gifts grew from pity into respect, and the baker included an extra loaf on Sundays with a note about pride in keeping their
own. The small victories accumulated and created momentum. Emma continued to teach the children, and they began to show progress. Lily's handwriting transformed from erratic loops into neat names. Samuel learned to count receipts, and Benny grew stronger, his laugh returning like a spring thaw. The town's whispers shifted into quieter curiosity. Emma herself found a new rhythm that was neither resignation nor immediate affection, but an emergent kind of contentment that comes from competence and care. A confrontation with a visiting cousin of Mary's brought another deep, piercing tension. The cousin arrived with questions about inheritance and about Mary's locket, a small oval of silver with a photograph inside that Mary had worn as if it were a compass. The cousin alleged that the locket had a place in the family's line and demanded its return. Emma had found the locket in a drawer and had worn it sometimes at night, like a talisman, the cool silver against her skin reminding her that a woman had once lived there fully. The dispute played out over dinner, with voices that rose and then fell into thin, polite anger. Nathan defended Emma's quiet possession of the locket by saying Mary had given it to him to keep, but then did not claim it strongly at first. The question of rightful ownership was part of the larger theme of what it means to inherit love as well as property. The town watched. The matter was settled finally with a gesture that was both legal and humane. Nathan left the locket with Emma until the cousin provided evidence, and then, when the cousin confessed that the family had enough tokens of memory, Nathan asked that the locket stay. He said he would rather see it hang over a beating heart than in a box. That choice, practical and almost tender, tilted opinions. Over time, the house experienced a season that would be the pivot of change. Summer came with heat and hard labor and a crisis of nature that required collective action. A storm swept through with hail that battered the fields and wounded a young colt. The ranch men and women worked together, mending fences and sheltering livestock, and in the middle of it, the children learned the town's true currency. Emma stood in a rain that tasted of iron and grass, soaked through to her linen, and together with Nathan and the hands, they pulled a colt through the worst of it until it stood wobbling and alive. The smell of drenched hay and the sound of strained breathing became the background for a day of rescue. That act of standing between the animal and the cold cemented something more durable between Emma and Nathan, mutual reliance born out of danger, an experience that stitches people together in a way gentler talk cannot. The story's climax arrived on a winter morning when the house filled with light that seemed to hold its breath. A neighbor's boy had collapsed in the snow on the lane, and there was no doctor ready that hour. The child's breathing was thin, and his lips a blue that did not belong to a sleeping cheek. Emma worked with a measured calm, instructing Lily to fetch warm water, telling Samuel to rouse the neighbors and bring blankets. The dialogue during this moment had 10 exchanges as the household orchestrated aid. "Bring the wool blankets from the chest," Emma ordered. "I am calling for Dr. Marsh," Nathan said, but the roads were already slick. "No," Emma replied, hands at the boy's chest, "he must have warm blood." Someone applied friction, someone carried hot water, someone chafed the boy's arms. Emma put her ear to his chest and felt the flutter of life return, faint as a moth's wings. The child coughed and then opened his eyes. That rescue was a physical act that crossed into emotional territory, and afterward, Nathan rested his forehead against Emma's hand in a touch that was neither judge nor lover, but a man who had witnessed someone else save what he cared for. It was a consummation of trust rather than of passion. The night after the rescue, warmed by the steady glow of the stove,
Nathan and Emma sat with the children asleep and spoke in ways that hinted at the deepening of their bond. The conversation explored the shape of what they had become, and they acknowledged that they had found a life together that was not predicated on romance, but on an arithmetic of care. They spoke of memory and of the ways grief had taught them kindness. There was a scene of confession where Nathan admitted his fear of loving again because he feared his heart might be taken with the next misfortune. Emma confessed that she feared wanting something she might not be permitted to keep. The 10 exchanges that composed that conversation moved from vulnerability to a quiet pledge. "We will need time," Nathan said, and Emma answered, "We have it now, and we will use it." The sensory details were soft: the scent of tea, the roughness of her palm against his jaw, the tired creak of the porch boards as wind shifted. The room hummed with a new kind of serenity. A series of small successes followed the climax and pointed toward a steady resolution. The ranch produced a better yield than anticipated that autumn, partly because Emma had instituted a rotation for their garden beds and taught the children to save seeds. The barn saw heavier light and stronger haystacks, and the livestock looked healthier. The town's opinion turned fully in their favor when the local schoolteacher commissioned Emma to help teach reading to neighborhood children on Saturdays. The teacher, Mr. Hargrove, praised her methodical attention to detail and her patience with young learners. It was a professional validation and a social one. She began to stand in
the village more often as someone whose contribution was visible and valued. The epilogue arrives as a series of photographs in time. 1 month later, the house had a rhythm that allowed everyone small spaces of ease. Emma had cataloged 3 recipes that had become weekend staples and taught Lily how to set a table with neatness ceremonious enough to please the Reverend. The children had begun to call her with surprising casualness by a name that was neither Mrs. Reed nor a stranger. Nathan walked with his back straighter because he had confidence that the household would see them through the winter. There was a ledger entry that showed fewer debts and a small surplus of supplies. The neighborhood began to invite them to gatherings without the old hesitance. The sensory markers of this period were the smell of fresh bread each Sunday, the sound of laughter at the dinner table, the sight of laundry flapping like flags, and the taste of stew that warmed more than bodies. 3 months later, the farm had weathered its first harvest together. The yield was modest but sufficient, and the children performed chores with a steady diligence that made Emma proud. Lily had learned to plait hair into tight, practical braids and sometimes did her mother's hair at nights, a small ritual that felt intimate and steady. Nathan began to show his gratitude in small tokens: a cup of tea brought without being asked, a repaired tool left on the table the next morning, a seat saved at the market's booth. The town's acceptance had moved from tolerance to genuine admiration. People began to seek Emma's counsel on small matters of household management. The house now smelled often of clean linen and beeswax, with the occasional lingering note of Mary's lavender shawl in the closet, where it lay like a memory that neither intruded nor judged. 6 months later, the most tangible sign of transformation arrived in the form of a new life. Emma was with child, and the household prepared for the possibility of new addition with a mixture of nervousness and joy. The children made drawings and placed them in a small box that would become part of the child's memory. Many rituals were practiced to welcome the infant. The old midwife came and checked the household goods, and the neighbors left gifts of tiny knitted garments. The farm's ledger showed a modest growth in produce sales and a lower count of unpaid bills. The town, which had once debated the morality of an arranged match, now spoke of the Reeds as a model of perseverance. The sensory moments of that period included the soft scrape of needlework replacing the harsh clink of ledger coins, the taste of warm milk poured by a hand that had once feared taking on the work, the sound of lullaby hummed by a man who had once been suspected of an interior hardness. There were, through this 6-month arc, at least 5 named secondary characters who acted with clear intention across the narrative. Sheriff Leary provided law and distant reassurance, appearing at the gate with updates on county matters. Rosa Mitchell carried food and gave practical advice on preserving.
Dr. Marsh offered medical aid and blunt counsel and was present at Benny's fever and at the final prenatal checks. Mrs. Cartwright from the bakery offered social commentary in the form of a generous loaf and an on-pointed word. Judge Whitcomb mediated legal conflicts and left the couple with a sense of procedural legitimacy. These characters each had actions tied to them and recurred in ways that anchored Emma and Nathan into the community's fabric. Throughout the campaign of seasons, there were repeated sensory anchors. The blue dress resurfaced at key moments, worn to the market on the day Emma paid off a small debt, and again when she read a sermon to the Sunday congregation. The silver locket remained tucked in her apron until the day when she chose to hang it over the nursery crib as if passing on Mary's memory in a deliberate act. The old clock over the mantel kept time like a witness, and the smell of lavender became a symbol of memory honored rather than mourned. These repeating objects acted as emotional anchors during crises and celebrations, the way certain songs can call a room back into being. There were technical procedures described at certain points, because life on a ranch is as much about technique as it is about feeling. For childbirth, for example, the process was prepared with precise measures. The midwife arrived with boiled linens, a basin for washing, a list of herbs for easing pain and encouraging milk, and a small chart to note contractions. Emma studied the list and added her own notations. Keep warm, have broth ready, note time between contractions, and ensure the infant's breathing within the first minute. For fence repair, the method followed set steps. Remove broken rail, set new post with tamped soil and gravel, bind rails with wire, and check tension. For seed saving, the technique required drying pods fully, threshing by hand, sifting chaff, and labeling sacks with dates for rotation. Each procedural description had a utility and conveyed competence, and Emma's journal grew into a practical manual for household management. Moments of tension persisted, each unfolding into a two-paragraph intensity that reframed characters and choices. One such moment occurred when an unexpected predator threatened court action. Another came when a neighbor accused Nathan of favoring someone in the distribution of hay during drought, a claim that led to a public meeting. A final acute tension erupted when an outbreak of influenza swept the settlement, forcing the Reed household to isolate and care for the afflicted with limited resources. Each of these moments lasted long enough to test loyalties and to reveal who would stand by whom when reputations were at stake. The moral found its way into conclusion in a manner that felt both achieved and inevitable. Emma had come as a necessity, and through steadiness became the heart of the household. The Bennetts were spared ruin, and Nathan's ranch was restored to a viable operation. The children were steadier, more learned, and the town's verdict shifted from suspicion to respect. The final images are typical of frontier life. The rough warmth of the kitchen, the children's laughter like clinking glass, the steady smoking chimney, the blue dress folded neatly on a chair. It was a life not promised by contract, but built by daily practice, the quiet accumulation of trust. If you were in Emma's place now, how would you react? Would you accept the bargain for the sake of family and community? Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, and begin your answer with "I" so I can read it and include some of your responses in a future episode. I read every comment, and I want to hear whether people would endure such a sacrifice or look for another path. When you write, start with "I" and then say if you would stay or leave and why. Your perspectives matter, and the community here grows with these shared decisions. Now, back to the story. As the children's schooling continued, and as winter gave way to a cautious spring, the household settled into something that looked less like compromise and more like chosen belonging. In the months that followed, there were small consummations of life. Nathan took to bringing a cup of tea to Emma in the mornings when frost rimmed the windows and the children were still asleep. He started to tell stories of his wife Mary, not as a shadow, but as a part of the family's narrative. And he invited the children to remember what they could of her with gratitude. Emma, for her part, planted a small bed of herbs near the kitchen door and taught Lily to tend rosemary and thyme, the sense of which became a new olfactory map of the house. The house that had once been a place of management became a home in practices and in quiet devotion. The transformation was not elegant, but it was real. It was held in the mundane, the way a hand steadies another at a table until both stop trembling. The last passage of the tale draws together consequence and message. Emma arrived at the Reed Ranch carrying little more than a blue dress and a quiet resolve. And she became someone who kept a household together, taught children how to read and tend, and knitted together the ragged edges of a family into something useful. Nathan learned to open his hands in ways that made room for new affections. And the children acquired both a teacher and a steady mother figure. The community learned that a union begun for need can grow into mutual tenderness when two people choose to be kind and to take the work of one another seriously. That turn is the largest lesson in smallness that the frontier teaches, that day-by-day acts of care can create a life larger than what any single person could achieve alone. 1 month after the events that christened their new life, the household counted blessings new and small. Bread was more plentiful, debts were being paid on schedule, and the children had become regular at their lessons. Nathan and Emma had worked out a schedule for chores that included time for study and time for rest. The blue dress was cleaned and stored with the locket, placed beside it as a talisman of both past and present. The smell of the kitchen was bread and beeswax and warm milk. The children's laughter had grown less cautious and more spontaneous, and the neighbors' visits were now friendly without pity. The house felt like it had a pulse, and the ledger reflected small improvements in the farm's accounts. 3 months on, the harvest showed steady growth. The garden had been rotated on Emma's suggestion, and the seed saving had preserved varieties for a lean season. Lily's handwriting was a small marvel, while Samuel could tally feed, and Benny ran with a healthy bounce in his steps. Nathan had begun to attend the occasional community meeting with Emma at his side, and the pair were spoken of in town with a tone of respect rather than skepticism. The scent of lavender lingered sometimes, but was mixed with the hearty smell of hearth smoke and dry hay. Neighbors brought news and sometimes gifts, and Emma began to be consulted about household matters at the market. 6 months later, the most remarkable change had come in a new life. There was a promise of an infant, and the household prepared with knitted garments and a simple cradle made by Nathan. He and Emma named none yet, but they spoke of the child in future tense as if already living among them. The farm finances were steadier, and the town's approval had turned fully into support. The children's education continued, and Lily sometimes helped with lessons to younger neighbors. The blue dress and the silver locket were placed in the nursery trunk, as relics of a beginning rather than proof of ownership. The final image is of a sunlit morning, with the family on the porch, sharing bread and tea, Nathan's hand resting lightly on Emma's shoulder, as the children chased the hens across a yard that had once been full of worry and was now full of work and laughter. This story began as a transaction and ended as a household built by choice. Not everything was easy, and not every rumor died, but the fundamental truth remained that compassion and diligence can make a home out of hardship. The town that once gasped at arrangement now greeted the family with warmth and calls to supper. This is a story about sacrifice meeting steadfastness, and about how a young woman at 18 can, by tending to small things and refusing easy resignation, anchor a family and reshape a community. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing for more narratives of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, and share it with someone who appreciates the slow work of belonging.